He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 29 years of experience. Together, Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. Henry, we're back with another episode. We're going to do a nuts and bolts discussion today. And you brought this up in a conversation we had before we hit the record button, and I think it's really valuable and important, something we haven't touched on. And that is sometimes when the work is presented to the creative director and you decide what you're going to present to the client and you go in ready to go and you can't get a decision, you somehow you swing and you miss, I think is the term that you use, and you have to go back to the drawing board and rebrief the creatives. This is not the same as the work is shot down. It's just you're instructed to start over. How do you deal with that situation? What are some things that other brief writers need to think about when this situation confronts them?
Yeah, the reason I brought this up is because it doesn't happen that often, but it happens often enough to where advice for a strategist would be valuable, because they will encounter this at some point. And in this particular, and it happened to me recently, I had to rebrief the creatives. And the reasons for the rebrief can be various and sundry. Um, in this particular case, we had actually briefed, we had developed creative based on an approved brief. We had produced the creative. The creative was tested. The creative was on the air. It was tested, and it tested normative. It wasn't bad, but it didn't it wasn't like stellar in the testing, and testing is a whole other issue. But then another corporate initiative came up that was very pressing, and the work got the media flight got paused. And because the testing had come back normative, we were already talking about doing edits to the creative work, particularly to the voiceover and the editing, to try to infuse a little more emotion into it, to try to see if we could uh, pin some needles on the creative testing. And we went back to the client with revised creative, and for a whole variety of reasons, um, the client didn't buy the revised creative. And part of it had to do with extraneous circumstances regarding the macro economy, what was going on in the world, etc. And now all of a sudden it came down to me to brief this assignment basically for a third time, right? So we had the original, then we were going to do some edits, and now we needed to look at the whole assignment again. That's a particular example. That's not the only reason why you might have to go back to the drawing board and start again. But I thought it was a good topic because I think there's probably some pitfalls and some tips that we could talk about. Um, One of the things that comes to mind for me is we talk about, and we've mentioned many times on this podcast, that the brief and the briefing are intended to inform and inspire, right? That's the two basic functions. It's like I've said, if anything, be clear, at least be clear. And if you can be inspirational, fantastic. But at least they should know what they need to do. Um, and so that's true here too. In a brief rebrief, being clear is going to be paramount. But there's also an element of maintaining morale, which now comes into play when you're looking at a brief again. So, um, I have a few things that I've written down, but I don't know if there's anything else you want to ask before I launch into a soliloquy. I don't want that to happen either.
I want to just be clear that we're not going to talk about what happens when the client shoots down creative. That happens a lot. And we've discussed this and decided we're going to dedicate an episode to, okay, how do you recover from what you thought was good work, and then you got to go back and do different work because that may or may not require rebriefing, but you will have a role in that. So here we're talking about somehow the all the parts came apart and fell to the floor, and now we have to reassemble the assignment, which means you have to rebrief. So does that mean you rewrite the brief, Henry, or do you use the same brief?
So it really depends. In this example that I gave, my real world example, um, we largely used the original brief the first time we rebriefed, right? And there was a major talking point which had been given to us by the client, which now the client was backing away from. So we basically,
Mhm.
the exercise was same brief. Let's not hang our hat on this particular thing the client wants to communicate. Instead, we need to find something else. So it was largely the same brief. Then on when that creative got shot down and we were asked to reevaluate everything, it became a question of, are these the right products that we're talking about? Do we need to focus on one product rather than the two that were in the original brief that were kind of married together in this brief under a specific platform? And so that now required talking more about the specifics of that one product and what its reason for being is, rather than these two kind of dislike products and the thing that joined them together. Um, so it's gonna vary.
Mhm.
But yeah, and I think that I think where the you specifically feel the pain is when something major changes, and that does require kind of re-looking at the entire brief itself. Like in this particular case, dropping one of the products from the brief had implications in terms of target audience, because now it was a more narrow target audience for only one use case. It also had implications for the single-minded proposition, because it didn't have to be a compromise between these two disliked products with a kind of tenuous connection. Now we could go full force into like all the RTBs and an SMP for that one specific product.
As
But
a
a lot,
creative,
yeah,
I mean, that's starting to sound more juicy rather than less. My little antenna are going up and saying, if I had to address two things, that's a challenge. It's always going to be a challenge.
yeah. And so in this particular case, it does allow us to refocus and to double down. We were fortunate in our case that we have a lot of really good material shot with no on-camera dialogue, so we could put together a new piece of creative with a lot of the elements that are already in the can. In some cases, the client doesn't want to see a frame of the footage that was already shot, or any of that, because they want to wash their hands of it off of it and move off. And that wasn't the case here. I've had cases where, and it's probably more appropriate for that other episode about when creative gets rejected, and I could talk about that anecdote, but where we had to go and reshoot an entire spot, a completely different story. But I think the biggest thing here on rebriefing is really it starts to erode the trust of the creative team. The creatives might start to wonder, why did we waste our time on this? Do these people really know what they want? And that can be a sap of creativity. It can sap creativity. It can sap motivation. Um, there's also a question of timing, right? Like usually when you rebrief, there's not additional time given to the assignment. So
Right.
now your 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 timelines are very much compressed, and that's going to create a lot of consternation among the creative team, right? And then there's a loss of momentum. Um, if they already thought that they had this problem solved, a new brief can feel like you're pulling the rug out from them.
Hmm.
So a lot of this has to, in my mind, has to do with the psychology of the creative team. So then the question becomes, what do you do about that? Like how do you get over that moment and leave the circumstance in the best possible circumstances possible?
So
Um,
this brief was rewritten in the sense that it was narrowed in its focus. I'm going to just guess as a creative that if I'm sitting there in the room with you and you're rebriefing me, I'm going to feel better about that.
yes, certainly, given the fact that the one tenuous connection that the two products had was removed by was first of all was a client idea that then was removed by the client. It is a little bit liberating, but they're not always going to be liberating reasons or consequences of having to rebrief.
Well, doesn't this also beg the question, does the client know the brief or has the client seen the brief before they say you got to start over? And how do you tell that this is two questions, so I'm going to just, you know, layer them. And how do you know when it's a matter of I need to rewrite the brief or rebrief and we just need to try another round of creative? I'm
So
I'm kind of getting into our next episode, but I think they're so
yeah,
closely linked.
so I think that typically these rebriefs happen because of extenuating external circumstances. And that's what happened in this case. The client very much was aware of the strategy of pairing these two unlike products under an umbrella um, that once removed was not a, it became, there was less connective tissue between the products other than the fact that they both um, belong to the same brand. Um, and they're roughly in the same category, but in this specific industry, each product has its kind of own target audience, its own use cases, its own. So it this all happened because of dramatic things that were happening in the country in the news cycle. We had to stop a flight. And then when we came back to them with revised creative, they said, you know what, that moment is gone. We need to
Mhm.
relook at this assignment from the start. And then we did get clear direction from the client. I mean, we ideated with them on what some of the potential strategic options were, agreed with them. But then that still leaves me as the strategist with having to rewrite the brief and then give a new briefing.
Well, we both know that a brand brief, which is more unusual than a product brief, does exist. And we talked about that, I don't know how many episodes ago it was, might have been last year, when from the Creative Brief archive, I dug up a brief that Foot Cone Building had written for the Dodge brand. It was three Dodge automobiles, one of which really didn't quite fit the muscle car descriptor, but they included it. It was the Charger. It was the I don't even remember. But what made it fun and unusual for us to talk about was the fact that it was a brand brief, and we rarely see those. Without asking you to reveal what's going on here, is you did hint that this was a two products within the same brand. So now they're decoupled. And that, I mean, as a creative, again, I'm saying that's going to, unless it's a brand message.
Well, there was a lot of internal conversation about where this campaign was supposed to live within the brand funnel. Like it wasn't an awareness generating top of funnel brand campaign. This was considered more of a consideration generating campaign, um, talking about the affordability of these dislike unlike products.
Right.
With the connective tissue that they had was that they were more or less similarly priced, um, at what is arguably an achievable price for this, not a premium price for this type of product.
Because I get it. As a creative, I want to have those opportunities, however rare they might be, to do a branding campaign. Because, in my career, 26 years in the ad agency world, I was always selling one product at a time.
Well,
That's pretty much
so
with
that's gonna,
exceptions.
that's gonna vary um, by client and by
Yep.
situation. A lot of clients are in a product advertising mode. Um, and so that's just the way that it is. The other issue, and you mentioned, I mean, I think you're right. I think creatives prefer to work on big brand assignments, but when you reach a certain level of fatigue, and I think that that's one of the challenges here when you're rebriefing is they get to a point of like, just tell me what I have to say. Like they don't, they're
Right.
like, just tell me what I have to say.
Well,
So
what do you say to the creatives to keep that morale, to keep that
yeah,
energy level up?
so there's a few tips. The first one is, communicate the clear reason for the rebrief. Don't try to bullshit them on it. Don't gaslight them into thinking this was always the plan or something like that. Like explain like how we got here. Like let's go back and take the journey. This is what we thought at the time. This is what happened. And this is why we're starting again. Okay. And then the second thing is to own the original brief. Acknowledge that it had strengths and it had limitations based on that was the best information
Mhm.
that we had. The third thing is to talk about what isn't changing. Like explain, what parts of this um remain the same so that they don't feel like everything has changed under their feet because chances are not everything has changed. Um, and then this is key. The new brief needs to be tighter, not looser, right?
Mhm.
Like we talk about, the freedom of a tightly written single-minded proposition of a tightly written brief. I think that becomes even more important in a rebrief situation. Lastly, um, or second to lastly, um, you need to reignite the passion for the project, not just redirect. Um, Use whatever tricks you have up your scheme um, to frame it as a second chance to do something even better. In this particular case that I'm talking about, because we shot a lot of really nice material, there's an opportunity there to be complimentary and say, you know what, we have this stuff that you guys imagined and it's now on film and it looks beautiful. The question is, how do we fashion a story that we want to tell using the edits, the tempo, the music, the voiceover, all of the pieces that don't change, that that can change around kind of just what's on the film that doesn't change. So looking at it through kind of a glass half full, obviously without being too bullshitty.
Mhm.
And then lastly, um, just communicate with radical clarity. Um, you
I like
know,
that. Yeah.
um, it's
But you know what else I would add to that? I would, because as the creative or the creative director, if in my role as a creative director, if when this happened, and it happened occasionally in my career, especially when I was working on an airline account, and the world changes. An offer gets presented, and you're building a campaign around the offer, and all of a sudden that goes away, or something happens because it is a fast-moving business, lots of moving parts. Get your creative director involved in that rebriefing and ask the creative. I know you have a tight relationship with the creative directors that you've always worked with throughout your career. Get them involved in the process of refiring them for this rebrief. That's one of the creative director's most important jobs, you
yeah,
know?
and you bring up a really good point because there's a question of you can't assume that every creative that's going to touch the assignment on the rebrief that touched it on the original brief knows what happened, right?
Right.
They what they may know is, oh, we got shot down, et cetera, or this thing that we produced. Now they want us to take another crack at it for whatever reasons but they don't necessarily know the details. And they may have gotten emails flying back and forth from account service. And again, the account team is going to have kind of their view on it. But as the strategist, again, we have a very unique role in that we don't work in the creative department and we don't work in the account department. So we're kind of have to be those interpreters, not just of the words, but also of the emotions, right? Like to say,
Right.
like, how do I best position this thing that happened that's causing us to go back to the drawing board in a way that is likely to get us the outcome that we want rather than demotivate, sap creativity, create resentment, and create confusion.
These are we're talking about one of two topics that we're going to cover. So this is like two peas in a pod, two sides of the same coin, two yeah, two sides of the same coin because they are so intricately connected. But I think they do deserve their own discussion. And I agree with you when you say that not every creative, the junior copywriter and the junior art director, is not going to be in the loop on what's going on, and might just treat this, oh, they shot it down, so we got to do new creative. When in fact it's more fundamental than that. So you have a unique responsibility, and you've offered some good pointers, some direction to for a strategist to follow to deal with a situation like this. So I think we've set ourselves up nicely for the next part of this conversation, which is, or which will be, the work has been shot down. That's a more common occurrence, as much as we hate to admit it. Now what? You're not rewriting the brief, but you've got to do something with your creative team to fire them up again. So that'll be our topic for the next time. So, Henry, good stuff.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
He's Howard Eibach. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time. Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.